Okay, welcome everybody. This is Script Camp's class on writing slashers. And for the purposes of this, we will be talking mostly about features. So although slashers can exist in other various forms on TV or even in novels or things like this, we're mostly going to be talking today about writing slasher movies. Let's get into it. So we are Script Camp, which is part of Skill Camp, which is a group of servers that are all part of this larger company that is dedicated towards creating these free and low-cost classes to help you reach new life skills and reach your different life goals. We have many different servers, which you can see here. And right now, up until pretty soon when we're going to have a big website renovation, you can find our website, our main website, at scriptcamp.net. And there you can sign up. One second, scriptcamp.net. There we go. You can sign up for unlimited membership for just $29 a month if you're buying monthly, or you can subscribe yearly for 40% off. We include lots of different classes. I am the primary instructor on Script Camp, and I also teach the Novel Bootcamp on WordCamp, which is our novel server. But we have other instructors and other classes on our other many servers too, including Film Camp for filmmaking, Code Camp for coding. We just recently added Game Camp, which has game design courses every Wednesday night. So we've got plenty of different skills. Not every server has been fully built out yet, but we are adding to these over time, and we hope that you join us. Again, the main website right now is still Script Camp, but pretty soon that's going to become just a Skill Camp website. Here's just a little about me. I have a lot of background in this specific genre. I'm mostly a horror writer here in Hollywood and specializing in features. So I do write TV as well and have written for Creepshow, for instance, for the Shudder Network. And for those who are into this type of genre, you should probably have Shudder, because at just $5 a month, it has a really good selection of slashers, creature features, cult movies, folk horror, everything you can think of. The selection rotates pretty frequently. They're not paying me to say this, by the way, but in any case, check it out. Shudder, Shudder. You'll be able to find lots of great content in this area. I don't think there's another streaming service that has as many slasher movies as Shudder. So in any case, the script that I broke in with when I first got signed with my first manager in 2017 was a historical horror thriller with a lot of very slasher-ish sensibilities. This movie, Peter and the Wolves, there were some differences. There weren't, we didn't follow all the rules of the slasher, but I always had this in the back of my mind, especially in the vein of 1970s Italian slashers, which are usually known as giallo movies, which means yellow in Italian, standing for, called as such to indicate the very cheap kind of paper that those very lurid horror-ish crime novels were printed on back in that time. So we will talk a little about giallo today. But we have so many other slides to cover, plenty of other info to go over. And as for the events that I teach, I currently do Feature Bootcamp, TV Bootcamp, and Novel Bootcamp. And we're going to be adding some new one-off novel classes coming up soon. And I also am running the game design workshop, though I'm not an expert in game design, so I'm kind of learning alongside everybody else. So here's the schedule for the upcoming boot camp. This is considered our week 0, so the setup week where you'll get an overview of everything coming up, and also we're going to deep dive into this subgenre in this class. You don't have to be writing a slasher in order to be in this upcoming feature boot camp, but it is October coming up, so we thought it'd be fun to have this kind of spooky season, isn't that what they say now? That's kind of theme. And to just look a little more critically at a specific genre for each bootcamp. So if you're writing that, great, you'll get more out of it, you'll get more info. If you're not writing a slasher, that's all totally fine. You will still be able to apply this in various other ways to your different types of writing. But in any case, week 0 is all about that overview and getting that initial feedback on your concept, or maybe you have some early version of your logline that you want to make sure is in good working order, so you can get that early feedback today and get a bit of a head start for the upcoming bootcamp classes. Or maybe you just want to stay for the one-off and you have no interest in the bootcamps, and that's fine too. Next week is going to be logline to outline. So we're going to start with loglines today, but you're going to try to finalize those next week and really get that locked down, that one sentence that expresses what is your movie about. Week 2 is all about one-sheets and the crash course and structure. So we're going to look at breaking the outline and writing a one-page synopsis of the whole story to get all of the plot beats straight in our heads. Next, we'll be looking at scene work masterclass, and we'll be working on scene cards, which are an expansion of your story beats into a full paragraph for every scene in the whole movie. So we should know essentially what happens on every page before we start writing. We will have an extra class on horror on week 5. That's going to be October 25th, just before Halloween. Horror and suspense on the page. So we will be covering more great spooky horror goodness for all you ghouls and freaks out there. And then we will be looking at things like that. Week 7 looks like it's called Slasher Endings. We will definitely cover Slasher Endings, but that one is going to be more just, broadly applicable to writing endings in general. Our final lab and pitch workshop will be on the 15th, where you can then take the movie that you finished up with and pitch the final story. And the final draft, the first draft will be finished by November 22nd if you're following along with the 8-week milestones of this course. If you're not, that's okay. You're not required to follow along with the rest of the group. But in any case, this week you will be able to get that just early feedback and that first impressions on your idea, or maybe you're trying to judge which idea of several that you want to go with. So you can come back next week for another free class, open to everybody. You don't have to sign up for this. Next week, same time, Friday, 6 p.m. Pacific time. You can pitch what you came up with and workshopped and worked on this week, and any of the feedback that you have worked into your project. So any of the adjustments that you've made based on the stuff you heard today and this that you made this upcoming week, you will be able to present that new version of your story and get even more tips, direction, guidance, and whatever you need on it. So we'll have a poll in the chat, both right now and towards the end of class. Thank you, Nacho. He's posted it for the moment. You can click those blue numbers in our Discord chat, which you can find if you haven't seen it already by clicking on the classroom channel. There's a small white word bubble that will show up when you mouse over it. That's called Open Chat. Just click on that Open Chat button, and it should open up the classroom chat on the right side of your Discord screen. And if you're watching on one of our other platforms like Twitter, Twitch, Facebook, YouTube, or something like this, you should come join us on Discord, which is where we host all our classes live with, instructors that are actually there. These are not recordings. You can ask your questions. You can bring your work for feedback. We have labs and workshops and readings and all kinds of interactive stuff. So again, scriptcamp.net is the website you go to in order to sign up for all of that and join us in our community totally for free. Okay, so feel free to vote in that poll to let us know if you plan to sign up, or maybe you can click one of the other options if you just have other questions or something like that. Here's the basic overview of the upcoming course. We start with week 1 on logline and story beats. Week 2 is on one sheet. Week 3 is on scene cards. And weeks 4 to 8, we go to pages. So week 1 will be just working on the very basic shape of your story. Week 2 is where we get more concrete and specific, and you actually start writing pages on week 4, meaning you don't have to even download a screenwriting software until halfway through the course. Okay, let's dive right in because we've got so much to cover. I'm not going to read these whole quotes from our good friends Mike Flanagan and Jason Bloom here, but these are two of the big names in horror at the moment. Slashers. This is a genre that we think of being kind of old or old-fashioned, but mostly just because it was played so heavily for a while from the 70s through the 90s. We kind of burned out on slashers because this is when the genre was established and the rules were kind of set in place, and when everyone was trying to cash in on this, there was a big trend of these for a while, kicked off by things like Halloween, Friday the 13th, which kind of created the mold for this genre, and then it developed throughout the 70s and 80s, a little bit overseas as well, I mentioned with the Italian giallo movies and things like this. And then through the 80s, we kind of cemented our current version of what slashers are, the rules and expectations that they fulfill, and the various functions of the many things that slashers can do, we kind of solidified in the 80s. Throughout the 90s is when we were kind of in the tail end of that, like kind of like where Westerns were at in the 90s, where it felt like everything had been done and it was just sort of played out. And it's when we started to see interesting both revisionist Westerns and also postmodern slashers, such as Scream, which kind of was considered to have killed the genre in the late 90s. 96, I think, is when the first one came out. And then in its wake, it kind of, like Austin Powers to some extent, was considered the reason for the different direction that Casino Royale and the Bond franchise went. It seemed like we couldn't really be goofy anymore because the goofiness had been entirely expunged from the lifeblood of the series or whatever. It was kind of the same thing. Like the tropes had been put on such clear display by Kevin Williamson in the 90s that it seemed almost pointless to be making movies in that same mold that weren't going to examine the tropes in the same way. So we got burned out on slashers, and then the postmodern slasher sort of emerged, and then we got burned out on postmodern slashers because the sort of Scream ripoff was such a thing in the late 90s as well, with everything from, your urban legends and things like this. I was going to say I Know What You Did Last Summer, but that also was written by Kevin Williamson, so I don't think we can exactly consider that a Scream ripoff in the exact way. But that is continuing the tradition that he helped create, which is the sort of post-peak slasher. So there's a lot of history here, but ultimately a genre that's only been around since, we might say, the early mid-70s. There's a lot of room to innovate and a lot of room to find a way forward that combines what we know and what has worked in the past, and crafts and combines these elements in different ways that allow us to push towards uncharted territory, which I have as our last slide here today, or one of our last slides before we look at workshop, which will be, where do we go next? What is left to be done in the genre? Okay, so overview for today, we can see you have so many different things we can talk about. We have more than 50 slides, so I'm going to move kind of quickly and not be able to cover everything probably, but I'll cover all the greatest hits, and I'll prioritize new slides over stuff that was in earlier horror classes because there's a bunch of new content for today. So starting with horror and thriller, I think even though that is an older slide, we do have to just kind of split those hairs right at the beginning, split them with your big scary slasher knife if you insist, and just kind of break down what actually is a slasher and how do we distinguish this from other types of things like thriller, mystery, and just really horror movies. There are bits and pieces of these genres that it can, that's what a subgenre really is. It's bits and pieces of other genres that have been recombined and reconstituted to do something different or to focus on just one type of fun that we have in the primary genre. So we'll look at expectations and then villain design. So what goes into actually crafting and creating the killers for these movies. We'll look at the state of the genre. So what's actually selling and getting made and being seen right now, the different types of slashers that are out there currently. We'll look at this concept that I've been working on called worry versus wicked glee, which are sort of the two ways that we can invest in, especially the side characters, but also the primary protagonist in your slasher movie. How can we sort of enjoy and sort of root for these death scenes in a way? We either really want the character to die or we really want the character to not die is essentially what that boils down to. We will touch on the topic of irony, humor, and postmodernism, so all that sort of post-Scream reflecting on the genre, and, characters becoming self-aware of these tropes, and writers starting to write as if the audience has actually seen slasher movies before, and the ways that you can use and weaponize that for your own ends. Bare essentials, so hero, villain, and victims. That actually, I think I've combined with the slasher essentials, so let's ignore that for now. We have a slide on rules, twists, and other fun, so ways that we can take those expectations and find another different way of doing them besides just parodying, lampooning, or, doing the jokey teen Scream kind of thing. Sympathy, suspense, and death scenes, I do have slides on towards the end, so ways to amp up your death scenes and make sure that our audience is investing in them in the way that we need them to, and that we are having the type of fun that you want to be having for your movie. And then last, we will look at that uncharted territory of interesting places to take the genre that maybe hasn't exactly done this before. Okay, or that it has not done before, I should say. All right, so plenty of info here today. You can, I hope, tell this is one of my favorite topics to talk about and genres I know the most about. I work in this space as well. I do rewrites and polishes on things in the thriller, slasher, adjacent space currently. Okay, so let's dive right into it. Let's begin with our definition of horror is going to be movies or series calculated to cause and utilize intense repugnance, fear, suspense, and dread for entertainment purposes. So we are weaponizing these normally uncomfortable feelings, or we're using them for entertainment rather than their normal function, which is to get us to not do stuff in real life, right? Like, why do we have the disgust response? It's to get us to not touch the garbage because it might have a disease in it, or get us to, avoid the dangerous animal because it's scary. These are kind of survival mechanisms that we are hacking in order to utilize them for recreation. So we're going to include incidents of physical violence and psychological terror. These might be studies of disturbed, psychotic, or evil people, or monsters and malevolent supernatural forces, or perhaps mysteries that use atmosphere to build unbearable tension and then ultimately culminate in those jumps and scares. Our main plot types that we see in horror are going to be drama, survival, and mystery, with slashers especially leaning very heavily on the survival element, though they can feature aspects of the other two. Drama being stories where the characters need to resolve either the interpersonal issues are at the root of the horrific creature, entity, or situation they're facing, or they may have to resolve those interpersonal questions in addition to the threat that they are facing. Survival, and that would be something a little more like Bodies, which pulls from the murder mystery and comedy genres too. So it has a bit more of that interpersonal problems in addition to the situation we're in. We have survival, which is going to be your classic slasher where characters are the threat is like the goal of the movie is not necessarily to figure out what the monster is. It is the question of how do we survive, or how do we kill it, how do we get away, how do we survive till dawn, something like this. And then last we have the mystery plot type, which many slashers also do involve an element of mystery, something like Candyman or what was the one I was going to mention that I just had in mind? The Scream, obviously, is like entirely based on this concept of the almost Agatha Christie adjacent murder mystery, where the question is, who is the slasher? The hook is it's one of our friends. It's like someone that we know, and now the story becomes the characters trying to unmask that culprit, figure out what is their motive, why are they doing this, and of course, how do we stop them? But how do we stop them is less important in the mystery type than who is it, because if it's just a person, how do we stop them? The answer is, I don't know, shoot them with a gun. So, horror versus thriller, there's lots of crossover here, and many fans disagree on the exact specific minutia, but horror is going to be more predicated on the scare, whereas thriller predicates more on suspense, chase, and mystery. So, and thrillers are often less supernatural, but they don't have to be. There are also supernatural thrillers. In general, these are, see how much we have to say in general. Most of the time, these are not hard definitions. But thrillers are often based more on the situation than a specific threat. So it's less that it is a central monster or character that is the hook of the movie on the poster and everything like that. It's more about, this crazy situation that the protagonist is in that they now have to struggle to survive or escape from. And it may be that there's also crossover in terms of horror thrillers. Something like the movie Unhinged with Russell Crowe is kind of a bit of both. Because it's a situation that is caused entirely by running into the wrong guy at the wrong time. A game element is more common with thrillers too, where we're sort of invited to figure out the answer to the question of who is the killer or whatever the solution to the mystery is alongside the characters, meaning that fair play rules apply. We have to not contradict things that we have seem to have learned, and we should be gaining clues at roughly the same rate as the hero, so we are on the same page as your detective type character. Generally, I should say it like this. People don't generally respect horror as much, especially slashers. And you have to think that when people hear horror, a lot of them just think slasher right away. That's all that they think that the genre really is trying to do or can be, when that's not strictly the case. And also, more than that, slashers can aspire to be more than, quote, more than slashers, too. We see all kinds of ways that they attempt to fulfill genre promises, but they can also kind of exceed genre promises at times. So that's something you can definitely use to your advantage. Okay, so now that we've got that old stuff, the just basic splitting hairs out of the way, let's look at what makes this subgenre special and how we specifically define it, and talk about some movies that are going to fit into this mold nowadays. So to begin with, the first and most essential core rule of a slasher is the antagonist, or involves the antagonist. The story revolves around a single central antagonist or a small group, it can also be a small group like the Strangers, who are actively killing protagonists or perhaps threatening the protagonist and killing other characters in the movie. Usually those end up being the friends and family of the hero. We'll get to that in the next slide. The slasher could be human, they could be supernatural, or somewhere kind of in between, but their primary role is to drive the horror of the movie through their relentless pursuit of victims. And it could be specific victims, as in the killer has a plan and a motive. This is more in the Kevin Williamson side of this genre, where we are in I Know What You Did Last Summer. Like, we know the killer is specifically targeting the people that he wants to get revenge on. Or in Scream, they have all kinds of different motivations. It varies movie to movie, and part of the fun is figuring out what is their motive this time. Each kill, and there will be kills, if nobody dies, it's not a slasher. Each kill builds tension, driving the plot forward and acting as a ticking clock as the victim numbers dwindle, and usually the closer the protagonist gets towards figuring out what the villain is or how to defeat them or something, or who they are, then the more the numbers go down. We don't usually group a lot of the deaths into one section of the movie. Almost always they will be spread all throughout the entire thing. Okay, protagonist. Protagonist's goal is going to be surviving, stopping, or escaping the killer. If your protagonist is doing something else besides those things, it's probably not a slasher. Usually they have to continuously escape the killer as they attempt to go from clue to clue, so that if we're in a mystery-style plot, they'll be following a chain of clues to unravel the origins, methods, motives, strategies, whatever it is. How do we beat this guy? How do we get the 3 gemstones that we need to combine together? Whatever it is. If it is a more of a survival type, then it's going to be centered on them trying to defend a space or get from point A to point B, a little bit more like an action movie. Something like the Evil Dead movies are not strictly slashers because they don't have that central killer type of character, but they're really easy plot types. It's defend the house and survive till dawn. What is the second movie called? Evil Dead 2, Dead by Dawn. The goal is right there in the title. The characters are vulnerable in slashers. Even if they are competent, they should be afraid. Predator and Alien do kind of blur the line. I have a slide about this coming up too. Like, is Predator a slasher? It's so close that, like, almost the only major thing is that the characters are more competent than they are in most slashers, but they're so outmatched. Well, let's get to that in a second. So, victims. There's an ensemble consisting of the protagonists, usually consisting of their friends, family, allies, and it can also consist of rivals or enemies who are also placed in direct conflict with the killer or stumble into his path in whatever way. The victims don't all have to be sympathetic. And in fact, that intersection of worry and wicked glee is a great place to play around, which I have several slides on today. These characters should be developed enough for the audience to feel one or the other, so we either are rooting for them to survive or rooting for them not to when they are targeted. And to that end, it can be useful or interesting to have multiple factions beyond just the good guys and the bad guys in these movies. Sometimes, in addition to the killer, there are also bad people, like in the Clive Barker model of these stories, where often there's the innocent hero, there are the monsters, and then there are bad people that are worse than the monsters. So, in terms of victims, they may be working alongside the hero or towards goals of their own in whatever way, but in any case, many of them will end up victims, biting the dust by the end of the story. If nobody dies in the movie, it is not a slasher. There's no way around it. You need to have death sequences in order for it to be a slasher, which puts us in that weird spot of isn't this poster of The Strangers? Yes. Is the first Strangers movie a slasher? No. But is it a slasher franchise? Yes, because the later ones, as of Prey at Night, are. Weird, right? Like, it doesn't have to be consistent for an entire series. The Collector is another interesting one. Is that a slasher series? Yes, it is. Even though in the second movie, it's about the characters trying to find the slasher, not about the slasher hunting down the characters. But they go into his domain, and then soon after, they get picked off one by one. And as we all know, The Collection is one of the best slasher movies. So if you like this genre, definitely watch it. You should watch the first one first, The Collector, just to get a little of that background and know who the main character is. But that duology, The Collector and Collection, are some of my favorites in this genre. So it could be that you have a slasher style villain, but it's not really a slasher movie. Like The Strangers 1, there are slasher villains in it, but there are no death scenes except for one. And so as such, I do not define it as a slasher. Weird, right? Creature feature blurs the line. Because some creatures do act a little bit more like slashers, especially if they're more intelligent. They use tactics or maybe have a bit more complex motivations. Like, I mentioned Predator, and also we have Xenomorph from Alien, and I would say the first Alien is basically a slasher, yeah. I mean, it's again so close that you might as well just call it that. The later ones are not, but the first one I would say is. It's not a haunted house movie. It is characters getting picked off one by one by an iconic central monster that is intelligent and uses tactics. And it may sort of be a monster, but it's smarter than most. What does he say in the second movie? How can they cut the power, man? They're animals. Like, they are more intelligent than most animals. So, to me, the first Alien is indeed a slasher. But then again, some reasonable folks might disagree. Okay, so, expectations. We can think of a couple different versions of this. We have horror expectations, and then we have your slasher expectations. In terms of horror, like we will consider, slasher is a subgenre of horror, so nested underneath that, it inherits many of the same expectations that horror movies do. And we have to consider that, just like with horror movies, the audience is very genre aware, which works for us and also against us. You might imagine the audience has seen a ton of movies like this by now, so we must be aware of those tropes and conventions and need to watch and read as much of this as we can, and always be thinking of what is that scare plus one. How can you build up towards something that it seems like we know what to expect, and then out of the blue, surprise us. Horror movies have been doing this, since they very first came out. Scary stories do this in addition to horror movies. Scary stories of all types. And we've been seeing this in slashers since the Giallo days as well. I'm thinking specifically of that scene from Deep Red, which is called Profondo Rosso in Italian. The scene where the guy is waiting for the killer to pop out of the closet. He's waiting, and then a tiny doll creature, like automaton, bursts out of the closet instead and marches towards him in a really creepy way. And he hacks it with his knife, and it falls down. And it's like just as scary and surprising as if it was the killer. And then the killer jumps out and gets him. It's like, okay, there was we built up to something else happened, and then the killer comes out. So always be thinking, that's a movie from the 70s. They were even aware of those conventions and what the audience, we're always aware of what the audience is waiting for and what we're building up to. And to be able to sidestep that and deliver something better that still fulfills promises is a really key cornerstone of this. We have a question. Is 13 Ghosts a slasher? That's a good question. I'm going to say yes. It's such a big group of slashers. None of them get that much screen time is the only thing. I think it's just not a very good slasher. I think we just need to tone down the number. We just need to tone down the number of ghosts. What about 3 ghosts? It's like my grandma critiquing movies. Too many ghosts. Anyway, it's not that bad. There's way worse. So let's look at some cliches and genre expectations, and we can consider some of these one and the same, right? Because some expectations become cliches over time. In terms of, actually, let me start with on the right. Let's start with some of the cliches, and the cliches that I particularly would like to avoid, or like to see people find interesting ways to avoid. One of them is the cell reception. I think you guys have all seen this a billion times. Hey man, does your cell phone work? We're going pretty deep in the woods. No, it's not working. I guess we just have to rough it this weekend. Yep, sounds good, dude. It's just living in the moment. No need for those stupid cell phones and social media out there in the creepy cabin. Either that, or there's some crazy set of circumstances and coincidences that leads to the cell phones being destroyed, or we find out that the character forgot it, or some total convenience that just gets us into this place where they can't call for help. I think you're going to be in a better spot if you can find a way that help is too far away, nobody will believe you, or it could even be that the killers have planned for this idea of the cell phones beforehand. In something like You're Next, they actually have an interesting take on this, where the killers have brought a cell phone jammer, and the main character then goes around like, have you guys tried texting 911? That works in some areas. And everyone's like, what? And she's like, yeah, try again. And they're like, no, we already tried calling. She's like, did you continue to try to call? It's like You're Next to me is this perfect balance of, it's not exactly postmodern and self-aware, but it just feels like it lives in a world where people have seen a lot of slasher movies, and so the characters just try stuff that normally characters write off in that sort of movie. Like, if you call once, you're like, oh, I guess they don't work. She's just like, well, keep trying. I thought that was a great touch and a great way to sort of fulfill the expectation while still leaning into a bit of realism here and verisimilitude. We Lost Deborah. I hate this one. I want to say Hereditary was the movie, which is not a slasher, but it did really shake up this paradigm of death not mattering that much in movies, in horror movies, where we will have a character gets killed by the slasher, and then a few minutes later they're like, where'd Deborah go? Oh, we lost Deborah back in the movie theater. Oh, shoot. Poor Deborah. Anyway, back to trying to escape. It's like, that is not exactly how that would go in real life, especially if the loved ones of that person are here, and you gotta kind of we understand why they don't do this, because watching the characters emotionally go to pieces and become non-functional after every death wouldn't really allow us to have a lot of the fun of the story. But then again, it kind of feels like a cop-out in a post-Hereditary world to have a character get killed, then have everybody, either you have one person see the corpse and go, ah, and then we flash forward to the funeral and never talk about it again. Or we could just be like, oh, shoot, not Deborah. Anyway, like, you have to kind of nowadays make the deaths feel weightier and like they matter more, and like that person mattered to someone. Otherwise, unless it's one of the many, villainous characters in your movie, at which point we can cheer or whatever you want. But like, having human life matter to some extent is kind of key for making it feel like these deaths in the story is just important, and it's not like we're playing a video game where we're just chopping up NPCs. We want to feel like these are real people that really live in this world, even if ultimately we're rooting for their, horrific fates. Okay, what else? We have Google the Ghost. This is a huge cliche where the characters will simply type in the name of the monster, a ghost. Oh, I heard it was called the Zibblzax, and they'll go to the library and be like, oh, the Zibblzax here's all the rules, and here's how it was summoned, and here's an old picture of it, drawn by pilgrims in 1655. It is just too convenient, and sometimes this is the characters go to the library. That was kind of like the old-fashioned version of this trope, but nowadays it feels like way too easy for them just to Google or go on some website or message board and just get everything they need, like all the answers they need right away, without that information ever becoming questionable or perhaps inaccurate or anything like that. So if your characters do this, chances are something could go wrong, or like they get bad advice or any number of other things, or they just can't find any info, or I don't know, the website is cursed or something. Just like find something else to do with Google the Ghost. And last we have It's Over or Is It? And this has been played out so much and fixed and refixed so many times over the years that even Scream was parodying this. But just think of the killer seems like they're dead. Oh, phew, I guess we can rest now. I guess we can walk away and turn our back to the killer. Jamie, he's right behind you. You guys remember this part? But yeah, so we're so aware of this that especially if your hero has bullets left in their gun and it seems like the villain's down, maybe have them shoot the villain a couple more times. I know most people wouldn't generally do that in real life, but you have to be aware that that's such a groan-worthy thing to see in a movie that you gotta just be aware that the audience is waiting for the killer to get back up. And so you must account for this. Jeepers Creepers had a fun twist on this too, although it seemed a little too self-aware when Daria's like, is he dead? And she's like, they never are. It's like, what do you mean they never are? In movies? So you're in a movie? What do you mean? But I like how she does run over the monster several times with the car, which is just a great moment and a great scene. Okay, so let's go into, because we have so much to cover. I know I'm talking a mile a minute. We have 35 minutes down with about an hour to go. We haven't even gotten into the meat of this class yet. The bloody meat of the class, perhaps we could say. Ghouls are what I call the villains in horror movies. They are the dark forces or creatures or antagonists. The three main sources of these are going to be your character's emotional pain, meaning it is either a manifestation of that somehow or a result of that somehow, or it is just them becoming the second thing, which is human evil, in which this would mean a person deciding to do bad stuff. It could be because they have some kind of psychopathic illness, or it could be because they just want to, or maybe we never exactly find out why specifically they are doing this. Maybe they mock the idea that there could even be a reason, like we've seen in several movies. And last, we have a cold and uncaring universe, which kind of represents everything else. The natural world or the unknowable, the monster that you found in a cave, or came from outer space, or from a different dimension, or something like this. So in horror, let's break it down this way. Thriller, there's a man in your house and he's got a gun, whereas horror is like there's a guy in your house and he's crawling on the wall. Horror villains usually thrive on this element of mystery and inscrutability and the fact that they can simply do impossible things, whereas thriller villains usually will thrive more on cleverness, rational if unhinged philosophical point of view, and a hint of sympathy. I talked later about Don't Breathe, but the first is Don't Breathe a slasher is a good question. It's really close, and the second one leans into full slasher, but we're rooting for the slasher, so that one is kind of in a weird in-between spot. In terms of design, the visual is going to be really important here. We're writing in a visual medium, of course, and you want your character to stand out and feel like they aren't like every other killer just like them. You can see a couple of really famous... This is not from a slasher movie. That's the Mouth of Sauron from Lord of the Rings Extended Edition, Return of the King. Over here on the left, we have Blade 2 Vampire. Again, not a slasher. But over here, we have some Cenobites, which, yes, Hellraiser is a slasher series. You can see different ways of distorting the face are usually where we start, because when you ask children to draw a monster, the first thing they will do is rearrange the features of the face and hands. It's one of the first things we look at, and one of the creepiest elements to remove or exaggerate some facial feature, like look at the jaw being the main aspect here, or just the teeth here with the eyes actually covered up. There's something kind of creepy and unsettling about this because no person could see like that, right? Or some designs that are clearly would be harmful for a person, like pins all over your face, or the various mutilations of the different Cenobites, which kind of have this unsettling quality to them because not only do they reflect the sort of central theme of that character, which in terms of Cenobites is the blending of pleasure and pain, but also that's something that no person would do or have, or at least no sane person would do or have. Oh, also, I think I've heard this question a lot. Is Jigsaw a slasher? Jigsaw, the character, is indeed a slasher, and the series is a slasher franchise, but the trap kind of structure is like the slasher's way of working remotely or by proxy. So yes, he's not killing people himself, but that's kind of his hook, is that he doesn't. He sets up traps in situations where those people fall prey to his schemes, but it is still a slasher franchise, absolutely. Okay, so let's look at some Guillermo del Toro tips on monster design. I think he is, in most people's estimation, the currently reigning king of designing monsters. Silhouettes are a good place to start. The face and the silhouette is where I usually begin. And afterwards, we want to play with movement. So how does the character actually get around? Does it float? Does it walk on walls? Does it crawl on all fours? Does he go backwards like in Malignant? Does he stick to stuff? Does he float up from the ground? Does he come through the mirror? Think of how does the character actually manifest and get around the world? Does he have a cool car like Stuntman Mike from Grindhouse? Next, we have color. So think of what colors do we see with the character. So after we've picked that silhouette, you can start filling it in with more details. You don't want to overdo it with the blood. Blood is a nice accent, but having a character that is nothing but, covered in blood and gore every time doesn't leave you many places to go, because you can only get so bloody, and then you're covered head to toe. And after that, think of the French New Extremities slasher type movies from the late 2000s. Usually are going to end with your character literally soaked head to toe in blood. Movies like Inside, Frontiers, High Tension. So we'll start with those broad strokes, and then we'll fill in the detail, starting with the face, moving on to color, and then things like the limbs, the weapons. What weapons do they use or not use? What rules do they follow, or what limitations or constraints are they faced with? Don't just start with a bunch of details and rules. Start with those broad strokes, the bold shapes. How can we identify the character from far away? Then once they get up close, what does that creepy face look like? How would that look in a jump scare? And then add details after that, but not too many. Don't just stack up stuff on your character like you're in the Soul Calibur character creator and you're just putting hat after hat after hat on your guy. A little goes a long way. Emphasis stops emphasizing when it is ubiquitous. Okay, I've kind of covered all this, so I'll just skip past that for now. We've got way too much to cover. So, abilities, limitations, and threat. So, in fantasy writing, we sometimes talk about this rule that Brandon Sanderson has developed, which is called the second law. Sanderson's second law. Limitations are more important than powers. So we can apply this to horror very easily. The limitations of a ghoul are often going to give you more interesting ideas of how it can be scary, interesting, or impactful in the story, rather than its capabilities. Giving a slasher 100 things that he can do is going to just be like a list of, it's just going to tune out into white noise in the viewer's head after a while. Whereas like 2 or 3 times, or like one way that the killer can appear, think of Candyman, right? When can Candyman actually show up? You have to deliberately say his name while looking into a mirror or other reflective surface, as we see in Candyman 2 when the guy looks into a very shiny book. So it doesn't have to strictly be a mirror. It can be anything shiny. And then it's the rules. So like we can have hard and soft rules, which is the nice thing. Limitations can come in that hard and soft way. Like after you say Candyman 5 times, how soon does he show up? It kind of varies. Like it could be almost right away. It could be within a few hours. I think we've seen it take up to a day, but I don't think there's a clock on it. And then when he shows up, how exactly does he show up? Does he always break through the mirror? No. Sometimes he like reaches out of it like he's in a kind of other dimension. Sometimes he shows up near the mirror or just in the room with the mirror in a different way. So you can keep us guessing by leaving some rules a little softer. Does that make sense? Like you want to define some rules in a hard way. Candyman will always show up when you say his name 5 times. But the specific way that he shows up is going to be different and leaves room for mystery and surprise. And that's how you can use limitations to create scares. We can make the monster feel more real as well as having weaknesses. Everything has a weakness. There's nothing that really doesn't have a weakness in real life. With some exceptions, like in Evil Dead, for instance, the rules are not very carefully defined almost at all. Evil Dead, again, not really a slasher franchise. I should say, not at all a slasher franchise, unless we consider all the Deadites to be one entity, which they are not really presented as a hive mind, except sometimes maybe in the TV show. Again, Evil Dead, very inconsistent with its rules. It's my favorite, one of my favorite franchises. I don't know if it's my absolute favorite, but the rules, I will fully admit, do not really make sense. So, what else? Some movies suffer again for having inadequately explained limitations on the ghoul. It is not. It is close to a slasher series, very very close. But I think the series does suffer from lack of specifically and concretely defining when can Pennywise actually appear. A ghoul with clear limitations is a very big part of modern hooky spec horror writing. So think of in terms of things like A Quiet Place, right? When can the monster show up? When you make when it's nearby and you make a noise, or I guess you draw it to you by making a noise. Don't Breathe again has that similar thing. It's a blind guy, a blind monster. Kind of you have to use your wits against them. You have to be tricky and not make any sound. We can create more tension with these limitations because they give us a better handle on when are we supposed to be safe versus not safe. And that question of balancing the audience's expectation, or that idea of balancing the audience's expectation of safety can be a great way for you to violate that promise. For you to make rules or scenarios where it seems like they're safe, but then actually, twist, they weren't. Sort of like what we see at the end of Nightmare on Elm Street, where it's like, oh, we've beaten the monster, everything's okay. Or is it? Wait, then the convertible roof comes over the car with Freddy's stripes on it, and we know, oh no, we're back in the dream. And Freddy's hand comes out of the window and smashes the glass and grabs the mom and drags her inside. So, having only specific moments or times where that character can appear, they can create more suspense because now we're dreading for those circumstances to come to pass. And when properly seated, these limitations can make your ghoul feel actually more powerful and threatening rather than less, especially once we're in its domain, like in The Well with Samara or in The Dreams with Freddy Krueger. The Ring, not a slasher, but just worth mentioning. Okay, so that's a lot of the very basics. Let's get into more specifics on the state of the genre right now. So where are we in terms of slasher movies? I mentioned we went through the heyday in the 80s and early 90s. We went through the slasher deconstruction era in the mid to late 90s and early 2000s, and then basically they were just dead for a while. We went into a couple of reboots and reimaginings and things like this with Texas Chainsaw Massacre at the beginning and all of those, and then a couple other throwbacks and legacy sequels. We had Halloween H2O and things like this, but ultimately in the 2000s the slasher was considered mostly dead. Around the 2009 to 10 era, we started to get them back. I think Your Next was one of the really big indie slashers that kind of revived the genre, although the big franchises had mostly subsided, except for Saw, which was like the 2000 slasher franchise. But I think you can imagine how Saw plays the rules pretty differently. I mentioned this a little bit, how it's not really following a killer going around picking people off. It's more like thriller-type plot lines where characters are trying to overcome escape room-style traps and put together puzzles. And then it's like the killer's influence and machinations which make up the threat, not so much a guy going around with a knife. So that for a lot of people that didn't quite scratch the same itch, and torture porn, as it is sometimes known, sort of came to fill this niche in the 2000s. As of the 2010s, then we sort of started to bring it back around to not only more legacy sequels and throwbacks. I'm thinking of 2009 Friday the 13th reboot, produced by Michael Bay, if I remember correctly, and starring Paris Hilton. That was a weird time. And it never really got back up off the ground after that due to rights issues. So we started seeing more legacy sequels, and also a new wave of what we might consider to be the current crop of slashers. So from 2010 to now is like our current era. So let's look at the state of the slasher as it currently stands. We have throwbacks, and that's going to be stuff like Thanksgiving, which are harkening back to that sort of heyday of 70s and 80s era slasher movies. Some filmmakers like Eli Roth and Ty West, even they both do throwback style movies in addition to other types. Thanksgiving was a recent big one, but we also are seeing reboots and legacy sequels, which never really went away, like I mentioned. But now we're seeing older franchises come back. So like there hasn't been a new Halloween since, I think, H2O, right? Wasn't that the most recent one? Somebody can correct me there if they are able in the text chat. But regardless of that, we are still seeing continuance of these ancient dinosaur franchises that just keep going and keep going. Friday the 13th, Freddy Krueger will be back, believe me, sooner rather than later. They're also they brought back Puppet Master. There have been a couple attempts to bring back Leprechaun. Everything that was a franchise at one point is being mined and explored in this, risk-averse environment where less movies are getting made. It simply behooves people making movies to bank on something that we know will work. So, of course, we just saw a slasher, I would call it a bit of a revival with the new Halloween trilogy. And of course we never really stopped getting Scream movies, though they stopped being good after 4. Though I do love Scream 4. And then we have our goofy grindhouse, which is going to be, this also never exactly went away, but this is like your straight to Redbox or straight to streaming type of movies. And this is going to be stuff like your Terrifier and Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey, and the kind of like ridiculous low budget streaming slashers that might have an element of humor to them, or just kind of over the top exaggerated characters. And I think there was a Mickey Mouse one after Mickey Mouse went public domain, so this does include what we might consider to be cash grabs and things like this. But I would call it Goofy Grindhouse because they don't take themselves way too seriously. Usually they're really over the top and gory, and they basically just try to deliver on the genre promises as much as possible without really innovating too much. These are usually not trying to win Oscars. We have Indie Art House, and these movies are kind of trying to, quote, win Oscars, and whatever that means for slashers. Things like the X series, the A24 movies, X, Pearl, and Maxine. And In a Violent Nature was a recent additional kind of art house slasher type where we weirdly follow the perspective of the killer the entire time. And then, so this is kind of like a newer space here, and there's a lot of room to explore here, and I've touched on this in my Uncharted Territory slide later on in the presentation. And last we have Ironic Teen Scream, and that is going to be really a result of things like Freaky and Happy Death Day doing really well, and now we see more of these like It's a Wonderful Knife, which have started to kind of innovate in a different direction, where it's less about parodying slasher tropes and more about mashing them together with tropes from other genres or other series or like other plot models. That's kind of where we are. You don't have to stick to these. You can push in a new direction if you want to, but you should understand this is the kind of thing that is getting made nowadays. And if you're pitching and writing professionally in the slasher space, this is the kind of thing you'll probably be pitching on. But then again, in the low-budget horror thriller world, you can get original ideas up and running a little bit easier than in other aspects or areas of screenwriting. So if you have an innovative, newer idea for a slasher and it doesn't cost that much, you can probably get it made. Okay. So that's where we are. Let's pause. Just because I've been getting so little input and been talking nonstop the whole time, before I go into Worry and Wicked Glee and some of the more technical, crafty elements of today's writing portion, let's pause and open for any questions or thoughts on what we've talked about so far. So you can either unmute and speak aloud, and while you're doing that, I will be looking at the text chat, which is on Discord. And also, if you're on our different streaming sites, you can leave a comment, and we can usually see it, but it sometimes takes a couple minutes for it to show up. Okay, who would like to speak up and ask a question or leave a comment on anything we've discussed today?
We had one question about in the chat whether Psycho was a slasher.
Oh, great question.
7.
I think it's a proto slasher. It's like an early version of this. It sort of predates what we consider to be slashers, but it's Psycho is quite close. I would say it's more of a horror thriller with a slasher adjacent element. I mean, it does kind of have an iconic killer and stuff. It's a little early, but it's almost there. What was the other one? 7?
And I asked about 7. And I mean, I understand what you're saying. What defines a slasher? But it seemed like, to me, Psycho and 7 sort of subverted the genre a little bit, and that's why I had some questions about them.
I see. Okay, so in my mind, 7, it would be a slasher if we followed the victims and actually they had a point of view and voice in the movie. But since it's all about sort of stumbling on the crime scenes and the aftermath and the ramifications of those killings, it's just a really dark mystery thriller with horror elements. It doesn't have that slasher vibe of we're watching the death. We don't see the death scenes happen, so it really can't be a slasher.
Okay.
It is scary though.
Well, it's one of my favorite. I consider it a horror movie.
Yeah, many people do. It's at that intersection of horror or mystery thrillers that are so dark and scary that they basically are horror as well.
Yeah.
One of the first questions was what is the first thing you start with when you want to make a slasher fic or slasher film, I mean?
Okay, good question. Go ahead.
As in, where do you start when you're writing one?
I would start with the villain. So I would go back to our earlier slides we had on choosing limitations and a theme for your character, start with that silhouette and start to fill in just like a hook for the villain character. I mean, I would start with just the very specific, or I'm sorry, the very basic expression of who they are. You might say something like, you know, he's a leprechaun that eats people. Or, I think we've seen that before, it's not an original idea. But, or you might say, it's a cheerleader and she murders people using cheer moves. So maybe some combination of the killer's appearance, tactics, or motives is where I would start.
This one may be too big. Maybe we can address it in future. But a lot of slasher movies kind of have this Act 1 problem where it's just not entertaining in Act 1. And I don't quite know how to fix that. It's just part of the genre sometimes.
I think that's just because a lot of slasher movies are not that well written, probably. But an Act 1 can easily be interesting. And I love the Act 1 of Scream. Not just the cold open, though the cold open is a very powerful tool for making the slasher Act 1 work well. Like, it is such a great way to grab attention right away, and it's one of the few genres where your opening scene can be an iconic blockbuster moment. Because we don't need that much investment in the character to root for somebody running for their life or trying to survive or escape or anything like this. So how can we address the Act 1 oh, go ahead, sorry.
If you have a movie that's very by the numbers, you have a bunch of teens and they're going to a place and there's the creepy old guy on the road is like, don't go to that place. And, that's the Act 1 I'm talking about.
Right.
Specifically.
So to make that interesting, you can make the main thing to do is you have all the normal writing rules apply. Like you have a protagonist with an interesting goal, with a strong set of internal motivations, and we track their progress carefully as they attempt to achieve their goals and step by step towards achieving that goal. It could be funny, it could be dramatic. Those would both be tools that you could use as well. I mean, like a sense of humor with the characters, get the audience laughing, and almost any exposition that we need will go down smoother. There might be a mystery that you can start to seed the first few pieces of in the first act. Think of something like Cabin in the Woods, which is very much following... I mean, I know it is an ironic postmodern slasher, but it has a lot of fun in the first act laying out these questions as to what is this world, what's going on here, and what's possible. There's a lot of playing around in the late Act 1 of that movie in what I call the Valley of Uncertainty, which I've talked about in some classes before, where we know some of what's possible, but not all of what's possible. So it allows us to do scares in new ways, where, for instance, we spend all that time working up to this scene where the girls dared to kiss the wolf head on the wall, and then she finally does, and we're all on the edge of our seat because we're like, they wouldn't build up this much if something terrible weren't about to happen. And then nothing does. We knew some of what was possible, but not all. So it gives you more room to play around. So mystery is a huge tool. Asking questions is a huge tool in Act 1. Laying out setups. Yeah, setups for later surprises, I would say, are really key here too, especially stuff that we don't know how it will pay off for a while. Think of, it's not a slasher series, it's a creature feature, but Quiet Place. You remember the nail in the stairs in the first act of Quiet Place, that one of the characters accidentally gets their shirt caught on a nail, that they lean it upright by accident, and it doesn't come back until almost the end of the movie, but we're like, someone's gonna step on Chekhov's rusty nail. Someone's gonna
what about the characters themselves? Because that is also sort of a weak Act 1 problem.
Sure, it could be that the characters... so I think often we run into an Act 1 problem here because the characters don't feel very motivated, or their only goal seems to be have a good time in the first act. So it's probably that you need to give them a stronger goal as of the start. I think that Evil Dead 2013 even has quite a good act, even though it's not like a fantastically written movie overall. It has an emotional core and a drama and a character arc to it. It's about this girl.
Yeah, that's a good one.
She's trying to quit heroin. That's like a really strong motive for the main character, and interesting reason for why they don't believe her when she starts seeing crazy stuff. She secluded herself in this cabin in the woods as like a deliberate way to kick this drug. That's a really strong motivation.
It adds sort of a lock where they don't want to leave because she has to stay there to recover. So it's keeps them sort of grounded to the location.
Exactly. And it completely explains why her friends don't freak out right away, because they're like, we have to be ready for anything to happen. She's going to get unreasonable. She's going to lie to us. She's going to try to trick us. She might get violent. Like, all these things are laid out in the first act, as well as the relationships between the characters, like the central one between the brother and sister, which forms the kind of core of the movie. So I think the reason we often think there's an Act 1 problem in slashers is because most slashers don't really try that hard in the first act. But there's plenty of ways that we have to just follow other writing rules, essentially, and don't leave your characters usually don't start your story with the character's goal of just hang out and have fun. Rarely does that work. Give a point of tension.
Okay.
Give them a clearer, more difficult goal. Think of the first act of You're Next. It's not just. It's like a family gathering. Their goal could have easily been let's hang out and have fun, but no. The main character's goal is I need to meet your family, and I'm worried they're not going to like me, and all that. That we have to sort of ingratiate this. She's trying to fit in. She's trying to get to know them. She's trying not to be rejected by them. She's worried. So we have a role or a goal and an objective for your character that is more interesting than simply hang out.
Okay.
And it may not matter anymore after the killing gets started, but regardless of that, it might. But regardless of that, we are laying the seeds in the first act that will bloom brilliantly later into payoffs. And we're starting to learn the questions that we will later be wondering about. You know, the characters get to their secluded house or whatever, there's a green stain on the floor. Wonder what that is. Oh, I don't know. Must be somebody dropped some Kool-Aid years ago. And then doesn't come back until later. We're wondering, what could that be? How could that pay off? So the first act is actually really, really great space in the slasher. 1, for a gripping cold open. 2, to ask questions and lay out mysteries. And 3, to be learning who the characters are through the pursuit of interesting goals. So those kind of feel more like generic writing advice, because generic writing advice applies here.
So, Dream Warriors, Nightmare on Elm Street 4, I think that's a great act 1. I like that a lot. Okay,
Yeah,
I got good notes. Thank you.
Sure. That's the third one.
Third one. Okay.
4 is the one where they do all the like kung fu. They end up kung fu fighting Freddy Krueger at the end. I swear to God.
Okay. They all blur together.
I swear. Watch it. If you don't believe me, you won't believe me. But there's a character that fights him. He's like invisible.
No, I remember that scene.
Yeah,
I know exactly what you're talking about.
There's like a karate guy. I don't know. Maybe the Karate Kid was a huge hit, and they were like, we have to have that in the movie.
I'm sorry, that's just hysterical.
Oh yeah.
I've only seen like 2 of them.
They get way sillier as they go on.
Yeah, but
So
they
that's kind
have
of jumped
clear
the
goals.
shark.
In Dream Warriors, you have like 4 distinct characters with 4 distinct goals, and they're all working together on a team, and it's very satisfying Act 1 setup.
Right. Yes. And they're all, if I remember correctly, they're either students in a school or they're in an institution of some kind together.
Something like that.
That's a different film, I think. The latter.
I think the Dream Warriors are in an institution of some kind, but I don't remember. Maybe I am blurring them together.
I'm pretty sure the Dream Warriors is the student, because there's a different Nightmare on Elm Street that is in an institution.
Okay.
There's
Somebody
a
look it
lot
up
of
for us.
background noise.
Yeah, I'm
I
not
think
sure
that's
who that
you.
was.
It's not me. I don't have anything on. Not me.
So regardless, just everybody make sure to have your mic muted when you're not speaking. Thank you. Let's check the chat for any other questions or comments before I dive into Worry versus Wicked Glee, because we do want to try to wrap up with the presentation in the next half hour. Let me just see if there was any other questions I didn't get to. Synapse says horror adventure would be a sick genre. Yeah, then you're getting into the world of pulp. Horror adventure is a great sort of pulp subgenre. Like the Temple of Doom is an adventure with a lot of horror elements to it. You will probably find more of that in novels than you will in movies, weirdly. Okay, I think I've answered all the major questions for the moment, or at least I'm not seeing any other. Let's get into Worry and Wicked Glee. So we are going to watch a bunch of characters get killed in the movie. That's just a given. You don't have to be a crazy person to enjoy this genre, though, because the writers give us interesting permission, or in an interesting way, I should say. They give us permission to enjoy those sequences. I'm hearing somebody's mic just crunching. Michelle, can you mute your mic, please?
Oh, sorry. Okay, that was me this time.
That's okay. Thank you. Where was I? We are... Okay, so we get permission from the author to enjoy these scenes. Because how can you enjoy a scene of somebody being stalked and murdered? It's horrible, right? In real life, it would be. But in a movie, it's not. But why not? I'm hearing somebody else. Just please make sure you guys have your mics muted by clicking the gray microphone icon in the bottom left of your Discord window. Or going on push to talk mode by clicking the gear icon, then clicking voice and video. Okay, so where was I? We are either going to want the character to not die, or we want the character to die. That's Worry and Wicked Glee. We can have both in the same movie. In fact, that's going to be some movies like Shark Night Interestingly, we'll have those I mentioned the Clive Barker model of you have some people that are really nasty and horrible and maybe even worse than the villains themselves. And then we can root for those deaths while we root for the good people to get away. That's a great way to do it. When was the last time you were actually worried for a character in a movie or show? Let us know in the chat. For me, it was reading a novel, a horrific Western by S. Craig Zahler called Wraiths of the Broken Land. The protagonist is a translator in the American Southwest in the 1800s who takes a job traveling with a group of cowboys on their way to reclaim their captured sisters from a human trafficker. When the villain captures the hero, I legitimately did not want to turn the page because the villain was taking out his case of live scorpions and dipping them in oil, preparing to force feed them to the hero, and I just didn't want to keep reading. In a good way. Why is that? Well, here's why. Let's make a worry checklist. 1, the author is, quote, serious, doesn't hold back with the consequences, and there's no plot armor. So they've usually demonstrated earlier in the story, characters that you care about will die, and in horrible ways that we legitimately feel bad for them. Plot armor is this concept of the authors going out of their way to protect characters even when it seems that the consequences of their actions or of the story would lead towards ruinous ends for them. So we have to ensure that the audience actually believes that the story or the author will, in fact, do those things. If the character gets saved every time, then we're going to stop believing that they're in real danger. And in Wraiths of the Broken Land, believe me, those characters are in a lot of danger. We have that demonstrated many times throughout. Even the ones you like, especially the ones you like. Number 2, the villains are terrifying and possess the capacity for limitless evil. It doesn't literally have to be limitless because no evil is exactly limitless, but it should feel like, oh god, they are not just capable of doing, or the story is not just capable of inflicting these fates on these characters that I like and care about, but the character is too. And we have usually, again, demonstrated the extent of their wrath and cruelty beforehand in the story. 3, events feel organic, motivated, and logical, and not like we forced the situation to happen and the hand of the author has become too evident. So it doesn't just feel like, we made a big point of they locked every door to the house and closed every window, and the character's in a panic room, but the killer just happens to now be in the panic room. How did they even get there? If it feels like the villain can break the rules, or the sort of Pennywise problem of the rules never really even being defined in the first place, can make it feel like the hand of the author is too evident and that it feels inorganic and it feels illogical. And 4, our protagonist is sympathetic and vulnerable. So if they're sympathetic, we won't have any wicked glee. We shouldn't usually have wicked glee towards characters that we like. We are worried for them, which you could view as its own type of weird wicked glee, but that is neither here nor there. The character is sympathetic and vulnerable, meaning that they are, even if they are competent, then they are in actual danger here and they are scared. They should be scared. If there's a reason, there has to be like a really, really good reason why your character is not scared in a slasher movie. How do we build worry? How do we make us invest and care about characters in a genre where we expect terrible fates to befall them all? Well, you might recognize some of these characters I have brought over here on the left. These are all from the same movie. The bottom one's kind of underexposed. Sorry about that. But that's Kevin, the kid from the car in the traffic jam part of Halloween 2018. And all these characters are from Halloween 2018. Your characters might be funny. Think of the kid, the kid on the top who is just hilarious. Honestly, he should be in more movies. And he's a kid too, very vulnerable, like the babysitter is as well a very vulnerable character. We may have characters that are good-hearted or simply funny, and I mentioned funny. They might be likable because they try to do the right thing. They go out of their way to help people. They're selfless. They're generous. We have characters that are just entertaining. I would consider Big John and Little John from this movie as being in this case. These are two. They're a couple, and their names are both John. So they go by Big John and Little John, but Big John is the smaller one. I can't even say it without laughing. And Little John is the taller one. I don't know. Something is just so quirky and unique about that. It just kind of feels real. And it just makes us like them more. The fact that they feel specific is really useful here. That they're well liked by other characters. You know, you have your characters that's the center of the community, or is the group favorite, or is the class clown, or whatever it is. If they like them more, then we will like them more. And last, we have maybe they're pursuing an interesting goal. We want to see them succeed at whatever it is they're doing, whether it's for selfish reasons or for any other reasons. And we would probably want to see them accomplish their goal and, go on to complete their arc, whatever that would be. So those are just a couple ways that we might build worry for these characters and make sure that we are investing in wanting to see what happens to them next, even if, as we know in the back of our minds, It's not going to end well for all of them, but at least for some, we really don't want it to. We are hoping that they will find a way out of it, and sometimes they do. Wicked Glee. Let's look at this one. On the opposite, and I'm going kind of quick without stopping for too many questions or discussion with live voice people because we have so much to get to. So again, use that chat function to ask your questions. I see a question in the chat. What defines an interesting goal? Okay, well, that would probably be a goal that is very personal for the character, or if it's impersonal, they have some great reason for doing it. It would probably feel unique and specific to them, not like a goal we've seen a million other characters have, like avenge my dead father. Or if it is the same goal we've seen a million characters have, then they're going about it in a unique way. We like to see something different from what we normally, something the same but different, a motivation that we can understand and relate to, but with enough changes or like, enough things that we aren't used to that it feels like we are seeing a character in a different light, or we are learning something new about the world or about the story. An interesting goal will feel like something we haven't seen in a lot of movies before, but feels logical and motivated and like it makes sense and fits in the world. So that to me is just some aspects of what would make an interesting goal. And also, feels like it will get the character into trouble in this genre is an important one. If your character's goal is something like, I want to rob a serial killer, that to me, I'm just like, that sounds so difficult and dangerous. I can't even fathom who would be crazy enough to do that. So to that end, it grabs my attention. Somebody do that. Somebody write a movie where someone's trying to do a heist on a serial killer. That's a good idea. I guess that's kind of Don't Breathe, but like that wasn't a very good heist. How about competent people do a heist against a serial killer?
Well, isn't the closest thing to that people trying to rob the mafia?
I wouldn't say so, because the mafia are just criminals with guns, right? They don't behave like slashers. They're not gonna like hunt you down with a butcher knife one by one unless they are particularly murderous mafia members.
I don't know, if you steal from them, I imagine they would hunt you down with a butcher's knife one by one.
Maybe they would, but in that case, that's just most criminals are not slashers, though, right? Because slashers have an elevated element to them that's beyond most criminals. It might be, like, is Anton Chigurh from No Country for Old Men a slasher? Kinda? Pretty much? Almost, right? But he's not in a slasher story. So just because a character uses some slasher tactics doesn't mean we're necessarily in the slasher genre. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Okay, so Wicked Glee. Let's look at this one. On the opposite end of the spectrum from Worry, Wicked Glee is the byproduct of a careful contract between the writer and audience in this genre, where we're allowed and encouraged in various ways to root for the glorious, over-the-top deaths of these central characters. So this can be easier to exploit if the characters seem to, quote, deserve, I put it in quotes, their fates. But it doesn't take much to get the audience to root for that or buy into that concept, or at least be okay with a character death in this genre, especially series that lean more heavily into Wicked Glee, like torture porn or the Terrifier series, which are slashers and also basically torture porn. Are they annoying? Are they arrogant? Are they selfish? Are they gross? Are they whiny? Do they do something that bothers us? That alone can be enough for us to root for that character to die in this genre, especially if we get the impression that that's just kind of the moral world that we live in, where doing annoying, gross, bad stuff results in punishment. We can even cackle at almost anything if we're given proper permission. The sense of karma or irony or righteous punishment are really strong ways to approach this. In the Clive Barker model, which I mentioned a minute ago, heroes are usually just as bad as the villain, and often we see them kind of inviting their demise by seeking out the villains in the first place. Like it's them who went looking for the villain and woke it up, or summoned it, or dug it out of the ground, often for power or selfish goals like some kind of hedonistic fulfillment. Or maybe we may have that third party of human villains that exist in contrast to the more pure and innocent hero like Kirsty in the first Hellraiser, who actually doesn't even really take the center stage as the protagonist until about halfway through the movie. We also have a couple other examples on here. I have a couple Clive Barker examples in the middle. We have your Hellraiser and your Midnight Meat Train. And then on the right, I have Creepshow, which is all about Wicked Glee. I mean, this franchise is entirely about... It's essentially Tales from the Crypt. Tales from the Crypt is the same story model. Asshole protagonist does bad thing, seems to get away with it or thinks they will get away with it, and then the ramifications or supernatural result of whatever it is they did comes back to haunt and at the end murder them in an ironic way that sort of suggests what key flaw led them to that place in the first place. And that I'm going to think of the example of the jellyfish story from the EC. I forget which issue it's from, but it's from Tales from the Crypt. We follow a nerdy... I'm going to get some details wrong, so somebody can look this up if they want. There's a nerdy scientist and his brother who is really overbearing and is always bullying him and pushing him down all the time and is always saying, "You weak little man, you have no backbone. You'll just let me walk all over you, won't you?" And they're working on this serum that is meant to remove cancer from bones. And then eventually in the story, it turns out that the serum dissolves all the bones in your body. And it seems like they're ruined, and the bully, he kicks his brother out of the house, and he throws him out, takes all his money, and ruins his life because he's like, "You ruined us, you idiot, you made mistakes like I knew you always would, and you ruined our best invention." And then by the end, guess what the younger brother does? He sneaks into his older brother's house and poisons him with the serum, turns him into the jellyfish, and he's like, "Look at you, now you're the spineless one." And the last panel of the comic is the brother stomping on the bully, crushing the jellyfish beneath his heels. You guys, I hope you get what the plot archetype is here. Bad person does bad thing and then gets punished in an ironic kind of way that usually involves their limbs and organs getting used for various bizarre purposes, such as used as the bases and implements at a baseball game. And then on the left, I have this annoying guy from Halloween 2018 who doesn't take much, but they really go out of the way to build a lot of wicked glee for him because we sort of are introduced to him at the end of a date. And he thought the date went all well, but apparently it didn't. So he tries to kiss the girl, and she ends up having to shove him away and stuff. And he's like, "What happened, babe?" And she's like, "You're an idiot. I rejected you. Go away." And then he gets left in this lawn with Michael Myers, and throughout the whole set piece, which takes a couple minutes, we're rooting for it more because we're like, okay, he's an annoying, pushy little jerk. Here's a question from the chat. That's an interesting question. Why are slasher films filled with sex? I will say they aren't really anymore, or they are less so nowadays. A couple reasons. One, it used to be harder to find nudity in the world. I mean, if we're already in the world where social boundaries are being pushed to, we're enjoying watching characters get murdered. It's not that big a leap to we can watch other forbidden things happen on screen too, and it became one of the few ways that you could actually see nudity in movies and TV. There was no HBO shows in the 70s, right? And there was no internet to look these things up on. And so you can see why there was just more nudity in movies in general. It was one of the few places that you could actually get that post-Hays Code, as Luke mentions here. Yeah, perhaps it's also, in some ways, a response to the Hays Code, which is a very oppressive era of filmmaking in the 1950s and I believe into the early 60s, where we weren't even allowed to show certain things happening on screen. Psycho famously being one of the first movies to even show a toilet flushing on screen. And it's a plot point because she's flushing evidence. So in some ways, it's a response to that moralistic overreach of the 50s. In some ways, it is part of the otherwise prurient fun that we are allowed to have in this forbidden space. And in some ways, it's because people like seeing hot, naked people, and there weren't a lot of ways to do that on screen in the era where these become popular. So it became sort of synonymous with the fun of the genre in the first place. Most modern slashers do not have as much of this. Good question, though. Irony, humor, and postmodernism. So we're in a post-Scream world. The genre has been torn to shreds and parodied and deconstructed and reconstructed and re-deconstructed and re-reconstructed and everything else. We're at the strange point where playing the tropes straight is a cliche, but subverting and turning them on their head is also a cliche. So where does that leave us? What do we do? Where are we? We're seeing an interesting mix nowadays of very funny and self-aware sarcastic slashers like Freaky and Bodies, 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 with the key innovation being that they no longer act like subverting slasher tropes alone is novel enough to give the movie a unique identity. They have moved to parodying or blending tropes of other things like holiday movies, like It's a Wonderful Knife, or Happy Death Day is kind of Groundhog Day if it was a slasher, or we have the murder mystery or the rom-com or other sorts of things that we connect the genre to give us a new perspective or approach on slashers. It's not really about parodying slashers as much anymore. It's about combining slasher tropes with something fun and different. Let's look at some more rules, twists, and other fun for our last 15 minutes of presentation before we open to loglines. So since everything under the sun has been done and parodied to death, let's get creative. We'll look at case studies from a few recent-ish movies, not always exactly last year, but pretty recent, and consider how to twist old established rules into new surprises. You can see I, of course, have Scream 2 Jamie Kennedy here for this slide, not Scream 1. So, Barbarian. The killer is not what you think. Here's how my friend pitched this movie to me. Whatever you think it is, it's not that. And I think that held up. While the concept has precedent as early as Friday the 13th, I think we all are aware of, and if you've seen Scream, which I talk about obsessively, then of course you know this, because it's an early plot point in the movie. Who was the killer in Scream? Or, not Scream. Who was the killer in Friday the 13th? It was Jason. No, it was Jason's mother, you idiot. That was already... Even at the birth of, or not exactly the birth, but even in the very early days of this genre, we were already doing this kind of thing of the killer is not exactly who or what you think. Which can lead to problems sometimes when you promise the movie is one thing and then it's not that thing. So if we spend most of it thinking it's a ghost, then it turns out to be an alien, you do run the risk of throwing the audience off the ride. But since Barbarian has such fun with this idea of questioning, what even is it? Like, it deliberately goes out of its way to not really set any promises besides something bad will happen here. We are left with lots of fun guesswork to do and lots of red herrings to pursue where that kind of becomes part of the point. That it could be anything. And by the time I won't spoil who the killer is in Barbarian for those who haven't seen it, but I will say it's something you basically couldn't have predicted, and that's kind of why it's fun, because that kicks in about 35 minutes into the movie, and then we go into, it's almost like another movie starts, and then we follow a different character, and then we start to kind of learn what that thing was and why that was the killer, and then we meet another villain in addition to that. So this movie was actually really structurally innovative and shook things up quite a lot. Was it something we could have seen coming? No, but here that actually became part of the fun, that it sort of could have been 100 different things, and the answer was it was none of them. It was none of the ones we were thinking. So that's a tricky spot to be in, where you're like, the fun is that it's not, I don't give you the answers, or that we hold back on the fun, but in its own weird way, that can become part of the game that you play here. How about this one? The killer is heroic, or in some way justified. Leslie Vernon, which is not a recent movie, but I do recommend it if you're a big slasher fan. Behind the Mask is what it's called. The Rise of Leslie Vernon is a very cool sort of 2006 or 7, I think, is when it came out, postmodern slasher, where it's kind of like a mockumentary where we are following a camera crew that is making a film about a killer type slasher. And he's kind of a good guy. He kind of is very open about his process and how he chooses his victims. And we really come to root for him through the movie. It's kind of an interesting balance of tone. Check that one out. Esther from Orphan, Pearl from X, and the blind man from Don't Breathe can sort of be seen as heroic in their own ways, even if they are a bit selfish or unaware of the full ramifications of their actions. With the guy from Don't Breathe being a bit of an outlier because he comes off as just villainous in the sequel, but what really works is that they surround him by villains that are even worse than him. So although we are rooting for him, a very repugnant, horrible guy, he's trying to take down people that are worse in service of somebody that is better. So he's trying to save his granddaughter from like human traffickers, basically. And ultimately, the twists and turns do shake out in a pretty satisfying way in that movie. I mean, the place it goes is more interesting than you think it will be. So you got to keep that in mind. Like, if we are trying to root for the slasher, you got to either pair them up with somebody worse, or like pit them against somebody far worse, or the victims really deserve it in some kind of way, or there's just something that we can kind of get behind in terms of the killer's motivation, tactics, or anything else. Pearl is a fun one in that she is very, very selfish and self-centered, but it's hard not to really root for what she wants and her motivations, because what is her motivation? What is her catchphrase? I will not accept the life that I do not deserve. That's what she's always saying, and she's a farm girl who has an abusive upbringing who just wants to go to the big city and be a star. How do you not root for that? I mean, does she go on to murder people? Yes, but the way that we get there, and ultimately, her heart is kind of in a good place, even though she turns towards the darkest possible path towards getting what she wants. I like Pearl. The killer follows a very specific mandate. Obviously, we've seen this many times because Candyman is not a new series, but and Jeepers Creepers is the other one I mentioned here, which is not exactly brand new. But in the way that the killer chooses their victims, in Jeepers Creepers, it's kind of based on smell or which parts he wants to eat from that person, or the rules by which they manifest. Like in Candyman, I mentioned that distinction between hard and soft rules within the same system. So you can have hard magic and soft magic in the same story, where we have some rules that always work the same way and some that you never know exactly how it will work, but the same thing, the same result occurs. And last we have Prey. I mentioned Predator is not a very strict slasher franchise, but it is pretty close, and I would say Prey is even closer because we have a character that's even more vulnerable than a group of, cool, badass Marines led by Arnold Schwarzenegger. We have just a singular girl who's up against, it has that kind of third-party other bad humans thing at play too, which is nice, and we get way more death scenes because she ends up getting captured by French, she's a Native American, I think she's like the chief's daughter, if I remember correctly, and she wants to be like respected as a hunter in her tribe, so she goes out on like a solo quest to take down this alien, which has very advanced weaponry, but she's such an underdog, it behaves a bit more like a slasher movie than the original, which has a whole team of badass heroes that are still outmatched, but at the end of the day, they're just more competent and more equipped. But since the villain follows such key mandates and rules, which are that he doesn't even use weapons that his prey doesn't have access to, the victim is able to, or the protagonist is able to use that against him in interesting ways. Like she uses his own tactics to draw him into traps and things like this. So it's nice to think of ways that your killer follows either, whether they are self-imposed rules, like in terms of the Predator, those are mostly self-imposed, or they could be supernatural rules like Candyman that they absolutely have to follow every time. Think of the different fun that we can have in your story as a result of limitations. Okay, I think I'm going to skip the personality slide for now and just go forward a couple. I would rather do death scenes than personality for the moment, though next week I can follow up on a few of the slides that we missed. I just want to make sure to leave some time today for logline workshop. So death scenes I'll cover for our last couple minutes. So we're going to have a bunch of these in your movie to build tension, raise stakes, and amp up the pressure. There's no real number that you have to have. I would say more than one. So that does kind of rule out the strangers. The movie is going to be moved in interesting and unexpected directions by these scenes. They're going to be a tool to explore what is fun and interesting about your premise, which often we mentioned where you start is with the killer, so the different ways, methods, incidents, or times that the killer strikes are going to form a core part of your premise scenes. And I guess we also have this question, do we need them at all? I've already answered this. Yes, you absolutely need death scenes for this to be a slasher movie. It doesn't always have to be the slasher doing all of the killing, but it makes the most sense for them to be doing it for the most part. Pacing. Who dies and when? Depends entirely on your cast size. Sometimes the whole story hinges on just a couple deaths. Like the first Saw movie only really has a couple deaths, but we do meet a couple one-off characters that we kind of flash back to their deaths to learn more about the killer and why he's doing what he's doing and things like this. Saw 2 is much closer to that traditional slasher approach, even though, and it is the best movie in the series in my view, even though it still doesn't have the slasher going around personally murdering people. And that has a lot of characters, so we get to have a death scene every couple scenes, really. Something like Cube, which is in a similar genre, it's not quite a slasher, but pretty close, is in a similar spot. We want to have, typically in the high death count range, we want to have 6 to 10. In the lower range, we have 4 to 8. Or in the medium range, we have 4 to 8. And in the lowest range, we have, I would say, 3 to 6. It's a real challenge to maintain and amp up tension for 90 minutes if it feels like we're building up to only one death the whole time, like The Strangers or Hush. There are ways to make it work, but we usually do not call them slashers. Like, it's not that the movie doesn't have any tension, it's just that we aren't building it in the same way. Okay, I have a video here. I'm not going to play it here, but I do recommend the On Feature Me. It's called Hello Feature Me is the name of the YouTube channel. He has a great video on killing characters. Okay, so how can we do better death scenes in our last couple minutes? I have a bunch of different examples drawn from not just mostly slasher movies, but not exclusively. And I will just be giving you some tips on how to make them work better. So don't think just in terms of scarier, because if you just pour on the sauce, I mentioned blood, for instance, being an accent rather than the main course. If you pull back a little bit on amping up every scene to level 10, then you can build, we say building tension, building suspense, because it's not just immediately there. We have to kind of ramp it up over time and turn up that knob and escalate. So to that end, you can't usually start at 10 out of 10. You can start with a death. Most slashers do start with a death scene, but you don't have to. And if you do, we can still escalate from there because we often don't usually see all the details about the killer or learn everything they can do or learn who they are. There could be lots of questions that are left after that opening death. So don't just pour on the blood and the scary, but don't just hit the scary button again and again. You have to kind of, to some extent, trust that the scary will follow if you're doing everything else right and you are investing, like following the rest of regular writing rules, interesting main character, pursuing a goal that I'm invested in. All the normal things that make a script good will make the scenes where those characters are in danger scarier because we will simply have built more worry or wicked glee or some combination of those. So we can pick sadder. Something like The Mist has a lot of death scenes in it. It's not a slasher. It's a creature monster survival type movie. But we do really amp up the tragedy of some of these deaths, especially towards the end. You can have if the characters care about each other more, then these are simply going to feel more impactful. And if we watch the grief hit those characters, then you can really drive home the horror of what's going on here. Sometimes it can run the risk of dragging the movie to a standstill, but sometimes it needs to be at a standstill for us to really grasp the full impact of these death scenes. Sometimes it can shake out that your characters just don't have that much time to mourn or grieve. That can be a quick way to move past it in some cases. And the Final Destination movies mostly use that tactic after the first one. We're not really going to funerals anymore after the first Final Destination movie. There's like a couple here and there, but like after the opening funeral, we basically are in like, we have to run to the next stop to stop the next death from happening mode instead. Okay, we have a question from Nacho. Can we talk about our approach to pacing the kills when planning the overall story? Sure. So typically you want a pretty even distribution. We don't usually like to group them all up in one area because we want to use the slasher scenes all throughout the movie, draw them out, let them breathe, and let us do fun stuff with them, like have different types of fun in them, learn new things about the characters and killer throughout them, and also you could be layering those death scenes throughout scenes of your characters, gathering clues, engaging in interpersonal drama, or doing anything else they need to do for your main plot type to sort of resolve. So I would aim for, in a 90-minute movie, a very rule of thumb ballpark, a death every 15 to 20 minutes or so. That will, leave you with, I guess that would be in the mid-range, right? That would be like 4 to 6 total for the whole thing. If you want to have a higher body count, you could have a couple of those scenes include multiple deaths, or you could fit in a couple shorter scenes all throughout. There are some, the Terrifier series is basically nothing but just death scene after death scene. There's not that much plot in those movies, so you can get away with a lot there. If you have a really body count heavy story, then probably every 10 minutes. That would be like 9 deaths throughout the whole movie, wouldn't it? And usually these are shorter than 90 minutes too, so you can cram a lot in. I would say make it pretty even, 15 to 20 minutes at the most. Okay, what else do we have in terms of making better death scenes? Know the tone and rules and stick to them. Again, not a slasher, this is a creature feature, but in The Thing we have this great blood test scene that I've drawn a picture from, or I've taken this image from here. And this is one where we learn the rules very carefully in the first act and early second act. And once we know them, then your characters can now start applying the rules. Meaning that now we know that the Thing, which is the alien monster from the movie, every cell is alive and active, meaning that if you cut off a limb, that limb is still alive. If it bleeds, that blood is still alive. Then you can take someone's blood and apply a hot wire to it, and if it's the monster, it will jump out of the dish. So we can use that as the basis for a whole scene where we tie everyone up, and now we blood test everyone one at a time and build an unbearable amount of tension by knowing what the rules are and knowing how things are supposed to work. What else do we have? We have beginning, middle, end, and mini act structure. So I have the... one second, sorry. Just have to fix my screen. There we go. I have Tatum Riley's death scene from the first Scream movie here because that is just one of the clearest examples of setups and payoffs. For those who remember, this is the one that takes place in the garage, where we start by Tatum comes into the garage and sees she gets spooked by a jump scare. Oh, wait, it's just a cat. And the cat walks out the cat door. Oh, it seems like a cat scare, doesn't it? Nope, that was just our first setup. Then she goes to the fridge and she opens up the freezer and she takes out the beers. And as she's walking back, that's when Ghostface is standing in the doorway blocking her. And they talk for a little bit. He starts attacking her, and everything we set up in the first half of the scene pays off in reverse order of the setups. So we start with the beer bottles, right? She throws the beer bottles at him and they break. Then she hits him with the top door of the fridge. Then we do a couple more things like that, right? We have the garage door opening. The button gets hit, the garage door starts sliding open. I'm sorry, I have one more thing. The dog door. She crawls through the dog door and starts trying to crawl away and get away. And then we have our last payoff, which is the door opening mechanism, which Ghostface hits. And as she's trying to crawl through, she gets stuck halfway through, and it lifts her up and crushes her in the door. Which is really depressing. Dewey never even finds out in the movie that his sister was murdered just rooms away. But in any case, you can see that having all those setups allows us, first of all, it makes us start to wonder, I wonder why that will matter. I wonder how that will come into play. And if you miss a couple of them, or if the viewer misses a couple of them, then it comes as a nice surprise later when we're like, oh, that's why that was there. So in a death sequence, the first half is setups, the second half is payoffs, at least in the, Kevin Williamson style. I do want to wrap up with these, so I do not want to take more than 2 more minutes to address these just so we have enough time for loglines today. Let me see which other ones I want to draw from. So somebody already mentioned Dream Warriors, so I guess I'll go back to that one. And that to me is the first one where Freddy's showmanship element and personality really starts to shine through. Because Freddy is actually a pretty well, I guess the second movie is really goofy too. The second one is kind of the black sheep of the franchise that is not often spoken of. But in any case, in the first movie, he's like a pedophilic serial killer. He's a pretty serious character, although he does yell weird stuff or say weird stuff sometimes. He doesn't exactly do jokes. Whereas in the third movie, this is the one where you see he comes out of the TV in somebody's dream. He's like, "Welcome to prime time, bitch." He smashes her through the screen. So this is where we start to see him kind of have more of an element of showmanship and wackiness that I think ultimately does serve the franchise, although it does go too far in some of them. It's a big iconic part of why people like this character. So showing off personality through the death scenes, or the death scenes become just a great place for the characters to show us who they are, and to use their unique tactics and whatever fun is specific to them. We want to see that play out in a way that could only happen in your movie. The bad guy's head coming out of the TV like this could only happen in Nightmare on Elm Street. Or I guess in Videodrome, perhaps. Okay, so I will just summarize this slide and use this to kind of wrap us up for today. So we talked a lot about setups and payoffs today, and horror is very much predicated on this idea of the strategic violation of promises and expectations. So that could be an unspoken promise, like, oh, we're safe in the daytime, right? And that's a promise that we can violate for a great scare. Horror stories are kind of like magic shows put on by a psychopath, in that we want to continually lure the audience into feeling like they are safe and they're in good hands and they're okay, and then just at the last second we catch them off guard. A character we didn't think would die dies. A scare sequence happens when we wouldn't expect there to be one. The killer gets back up after we thought they were dead. You can see how that was a surprise at a certain point. It's now no longer as much of a surprise. So we do have to keep in mind what the genre is doing and what the recent movies have done, and how we can always sort of stay one step ahead of our audience in a really similar way to how mystery authors try to stay one step ahead. The more cleverly we build or reinforce certain assumptions and promises early on, the more we can take advantage of them and subvert them in entertaining and surprising ways later. Okay, that's going to wrap us up for the slideshow. I'll leave you on this question of uncharted territory, then we'll go to our loglines. So what is left to do? Where do we go from here? How about just a couple ideas? Sci-fi. We haven't, like outside of Jason X and maybe Megan, there's not a lot of sci-fi slashers. How can current trends in tech, maybe just think, how can current trends in tech, VR, 3D printing, AI be used to create a killer, a protagonist or situation that just simply demands to be in a slasher story? I really like the idea of someone 3D printing an organ. This kind of is maybe I cribbed this a little bit from a Treehouse of Horror episode of The Simpsons, but if you can download a file that contains the schematics for something to be 3D printed, then you could easily get a virus that corrupts that file, right? So what if somebody gets a brain or a heart 3D printed and it gets corrupted by hackers or a virus, and now, I don't know, they turn into a cyber ghost, or they turn evil, or somebody can control them with a remote control, something like that. Somebody get on that. 3D printing and 3D printing organs has got to be in a slasher at some point. Art house or literary sensibilities. Can a slasher be an Oscar winner? Basically no, but what if, right? Could it be a genuinely moving tearjerker? I guess the closest we'll get to this is No Country for Old Men, isn't it? Where that is an Oscar winner that has a lot in common with slashers, but doesn't follow enough of the tropes and rules to exactly be one. But like that's the closest we will get. Could it be a tearjerker? What would Margaret Atwood's slasher look like? So ask questions like, what would it look like if this author, who would never write a slasher, actually did one? What sensibility would they bring to it? What perspective? What new POV? What new folklore or cultural element could be highlighted in this? Social themes are big in horror nowadays. We're in an interesting phase of sort of social commentary when it comes to horror thriller. What interesting new POV could be highlighted in a slasher story, or a specific regional legend or folklore, or some sort of political statement that you could make? You know, The Purge is a pretty political franchise, although it does sort of pull back from making statements that are too strong, I guess. It feels like it's a little afraid of this, but to some extent it is. No, in terms of slashers, it is one of the more political. So maybe just think of these ideas and be thinking of how we can always be trying to innovate and do more and reach beyond what has been done in the past to mix things up and keep surprising people, because that's so much a part of why we watch horror. We want the jump. We want the scare. We want what we came for, but we want to get it in a different way. We want to be surprised. Okay, that's what I will leave you on for now. I think a lot of folks here have worked with loglines before, or at least are generally familiar, so I'm not going to go into a full tutorial on what loglines are or how to write them or anything like this. But just as a quick recap, this is a sentence that expresses what is your movie about. It describes the main character in such a way that suggests they have the toughest, longest, or most ironic journey. Although certainly in a slasher logline, you're going to want to include the villain too, and make sure we're really clear on what the hook of the movie is, which usually is going to come down to who or what is the killer, what rules do they follow, how do they work, why are they doing what they do. We want to avoid character names unless it's about a historical figure, like, I don't know, the ghost of George Washington is your killer who's biting people with his wooden teeth. You want to avoid phrases that suggest internal goals. Nothing like your character must decide or begins to blank or must come to terms with blank. We want to craft a logline that tells us what are the stakes, what is the scale or scope of the story, and what essentially is the main character trying to do. What's their objective? Usually in this case it'll be to escape, survive until a certain point, to get to a certain place, or to kill the killer. So we include this both to communicate to people what your story is about and get them to read it, because it's a piece of marketing. And second of all, we have a writing purpose in that it's going to serve as our compass while we are writing to keep us on track and make sure that we're writing the same movie we were at the beginning than we are at the end. I'm going to enlarge this text just a little bit, but we are including Act 1 and Act 2, but we don't need to include everything that happens up until the end. It's just one sentence. We want to imply visual action. We want to know who is the main character, what starts the story off, the inciting incident, what's in their way, that's the obstacle, and what happens if they fail. Stakes are ticking clock. You may not have to explicitly you may not have to explicitly spell out, or else the serial killer will kill them, because you can sort of suggest the answer to that. In any case, here's the basic template. When or after inciting incident, an adjective protagonist must conflict before or in order to stakes or ticking clock. Okay, let's open the floor to loglines. Feel free to post what you've got, and I will call on them in the order that they are posted. And I'll give you guys some tips. I see we have one from Luke, thank you. And from Mario. Remember, loglines are one sentence. Try to edit that down to one sentence before I call on you. All right, we'll start with Luke. And I'm going to bring up a doc so I can paste these in and we can look at the text. Give me just 1 second here. Okay, Luke, let's get started.
All right. A lynched antebellum slave hunts down the family that murdered him. Try to keep it very simple.
Give me 1 sec. Let me just make this bigger. Okay.
Oh, did I
Lynched
misspelled that?
antebellum slave. Yeah, something in there. There's an extra I think. But wait, what is it?
And anti with the E.
E. Okay,
That's
thank
right.
you.
Yeah, I always messed that up.
Yes, anti meaning before, not against.
Right.
Okay. A lynched antebellum. So you mean prior to the Civil War is what you mean by antebellum?
Yes.
Slave hunts down the family that murdered him. Okay. It has a nice elegance and simplicity to it. In terms of that, really balanced Tales from the Crypt style. Bad people do bad things to you, so now you hunt them down and get revenge on them type of thing. But I think you would be served by a little bit more specificity. For instance,
Sure.
Why is he able to do this? Is it a curse? Is it like an angel that brings him back? Is he a robot? Like what? I think we want to know kind of why.
I don't really know the why.
It's okay if you're not sure.
I'm thinking just some kind of curse, something supernatural that the revenge itself sort of resurrects him, and he must sort of kill them before he can move on to the next life or something like that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's often how these things work in the Tales from the Crypt kind of world. That they're brought back by just the desire for revenge alone. But I would just think, is there something more there? If not, then you might find the hook elsewhere, which might be, what's so hard about hunting this family down? Just go to their house, right?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I could specify who the family is. Maybe they're the largest slave-owning family of South Carolina, something like that.
Oh, okay. And when you say hunts them down, are they like on a trip or something? Or is this like a home invasion type of story? Or
Home invasion, but they don't all live in the same home. Just so it would be a little bit of hunting them down in other locations.
Oh, okay. So is the location part of the hook here? I guess it sounds like it is because this is a slasher. The hook is always kind of the answer to the question, but this one ...
Maybe
right, like
the largest slave plantation in South Carolina or something. That's pure horror if you've actually read anything about that stuff.
For sure.
South Carolina has a terrible. Anyway, well,
okay.
We won't talk about that.
And the killer is your protagonist?
Yes.
Okay, and we're with his POV the whole time?
I think so. Yeah, and we could give him a family. Something like that. They kill his family. He kills their family. I don't know.
Oh, sure. Or his current family is trying to stop him too. Could be as well. They're like trying to put him to rest. Maybe he even lashes out at them.
Oh, that's a good hook. Yeah. Okay. The vengeful ghost. Okay, I like that idea.
There's a lot here. I think that this is a good premise. It is unusual in that it is villain POV, which means that people won't watch it, and especially because you have such a justified,
sure.
Like the people getting killed are so evil that you are pretty exclusively in the world of Wicked Glee here. I mean, you can build a little sympathy for them, but
it's Wicked Glee. It's the finale of Django as a slasher movie, basically.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. It's like if you make them Nazis, then you can say, but they have good reasons. But at the end of the day, it's Wicked Glee. It just is, and that's fine. So I would just lean into that as much as possible. And get a little more concrete and specific with either the nature of his resurrection or the rules to it. Does he have 3 days to do it? Does he have to?
Oh, okay.
Will he get to rest when he kills them? Something like this, or it could be the nature of the environment that they're in. Like he has to hunt them down through a swamp, or maybe the whole movie takes place in one plantation house or something like that.
Yeah, I think just a South Carolina plantation is horrifying enough as a setting for a hook for me.
It certainly is. Okay, so that's my tips for now, but the core of this is strong. Did you have any questions on it?
Nope. Just going to put a pin in it and stick it in my list.
Pin it and bin it. Sounds good to me.
Yep.
All right, thanks, Luke. I would definitely watch it.
Yeah, I would too. I would enjoy watching this one, I think.
That's how you can pick a good premise. Be like, if this was on right now, would I watch it? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to our next one. We got a couple more, and I'll get to as many as I can. We will have more time next week. If I don't get to yours today, again, next week is another free follow-up class to this. Okay, Mario. After I'll let you read it, but let me copy and paste your idea. I don't see it.
You can do someone else. You can do Ivy.
You want to skip you for now?
Yeah, skip my turn.
Okay. Yeah. Let's keep going. So, IB, are you ready?
Yep.
Okay.
After a set of naive teens are infected with a deadly virus, methodical doctor must hunt them down and kill them before the virus spreads.
All right, let me make sure I have it all. A set of naive teens are infected with a deadly virus. A methodical doctor must hunt them down and kill them before the virus spreads. Okay, is he the only one capable or the only one on the job?
I think he's the only one that knows. I think it's sort of his. It might have been like working on the cure for this infection, and they stumble across his laboratory and
Secret
get
lab.
infected.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What does the virus do?
I think it just horribly kills you, and perhaps these teens are somehow able to carry it with it. They're like hosts, so it's dormant in them. But
Okay.
if they're able to survive, but if it passes on to someone else,
Oh, they
then
can
it will
survive
kill
if it
them.
passes on to someone else?
Pardon?
Did I hear you correctly that they will live if they pass the disease to someone else?
No, I'm saying that they're like hosts, so they survive no matter what. But if they pass it on to someone else, that person will die.
But
So
they're,
it's
okay,
sort of,
so they're asymptomatic carriers, you say?
yeah.
Okay. You can do it. I mean, I've seen some pretty similar stories to this before. I mean, the cabin fever movies do go down this route. I mean, what's it called? 28 Weeks Later is also sort of about this, but it's not a slasher. In any case, I think if you can find something unique that the disease does, you might be in a slightly better shape, because this just mostly feels kind of, well, there's two problems. One, your protagonist isn't really clear, unless the doctor is the protagonist. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Oh, it is. Then, after, I would think you should start with a clear inciting incident. When a group of naive teens stumble into his laboratory and become infected with his blank and blank, so frame it more from the perspective of the doctor to just to begin with. He must hunt them down and kill them before the virus spreads. I totally get that. So I think this will come down to just how you present that inciting incident. And the other thing is just that almost like methodical just doesn't tell us much about the tactics that you're, like, the killer is a big part of the hook in a slasher movie, but what tactic is your doctor actually using? Methodical, like a lot of doctors are methodical, aren't they?
Yeah.
So does he use a giant syringe? Does he, or like does he use scalpels and medical tools?
I think he probably would use sort of mainly his medical tools, but he might use the environment as well.
Okay. I mean, the whole point in this one seems to be that your slasher is basically a good guy trying to do the right thing. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
And it's sort of building on that trope of the monster coming for the teens.
Mm-hmm.
But this time he's got a good reason.
This time it's very tragic because no one here wants this to be happening, it seems like. So
yeah.
that part really does appeal to me. I think that is a strong concept. The fact that it's a reluctant slasher. We've almost never seen that before, except in the genres where it's like you are the slasher and you're trying to stop yourself from killing people or something like that. So it's not a bad idea. I would just try to frame it from the perspective of the killer more and hint more carefully as to what tactics he's going to be using. I mean, methodical is just sort of saying he has a plan. It just doesn't tell us much.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Thanks for this. Let's keep going. I see one from Michelle, and then I see one from Dakota. I think that is it for now. Let's start with Michelle. Bloodmaker. So why don't you read this out for us?
Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to. I didn't realize there was background noise. Okay, let's see. Where am I?
Reading your logline?
Yeah, I know, but I'm trying to find my logline. There's other stuff that's okay. Logline. After a modern vampire 3D prints bones to make blood instead of killing people, should be a detective using AI sends a virus to the software, corrupting the bone, starving the vampire. I don't know about comps. It was going to be an AI detective, but I thought, well, it needs to be a detective using AI, though. Maybe you could have an AI detective. I don't know. You know.
That does sound cool. It just sounds like a different story, I guess. So let's start with the basics. I'm kind of confused. So we would assume the story to be modern unless there's something that says it wouldn't be. So you don't need to write a modern vampire.
Okay.
Okay. After a vampire 3D prints bones to make blood instead of killing people, a detective using AI sends a virus to the. Okay. So is this based on or inspired by my premise that I suggested earlier of the corrupting the 3D printer? Okay. Props to you for weaving that in. To send a virus to the using. So I don't see how him using AI is really relevant here. A detective sends a virus to the software, corrupting the bones, starving the vampire. But that sounds like the whole story. What's the movie? And why are we trying to stop the vampire after he decides to stop killing people?
Well, I guess the detective doesn't know at first that the vampire has decided to 3D print bones, or maybe it's just because, hey, this is a vampire. Vampires don't deserve to live. That's my bias against vampires, um, even if they're not killing people, they just don't deserve to live. So I'm going to kill this. I'm going to kill this vampire because, I mean, I'm thinking also that, well, if this vampire is doing it, maybe other vampires are doing it. So they're not killing people, but they're still drinking blood. So.
But they're going out of their way to not kill people, aren't they?
Right.
So doesn't it feel a little odd that then the villain would be trying to, well, let's take a step back. Who's the hero and who's the villain in this one? Who's the protagonist?
Well, I would say actually maybe the protagonist would be the vampire
It
because
sounds like it, yeah.
because they're going out of their way not to kill people. I'm thinking that this would be like some sort of like PhD, blood chemistry professor or doctor or something, and that's learned about how to 3D print organs and, instead of, but this person needs blood and you got the blood cells in the bone. And so, hey, if I just, print a bunch of bones that can make me a bunch of blood, I don't have to kill people. But, I'm thinking that, the detective, and I want it to be an AI detective, decides that, maybe the way the AI detective's been programmed is that all vampires are evil. It doesn't matter if they get their blood from a blood bank or they buy steak and suck out the blood, or it doesn't matter. They're all evil. So
But so is an AI detective, you mean like a robot?
yeah, basically I'm thinking that it's a software that can, that the government has back doors to be able to go into anything that uses a computer and gather information. So your phone, it would gather information, whether it's ethical or not, but but it's like a program and it would just simply gather information and it could follow this vampire around through not just the vampire software. I mean, not just like, their phone or whatever they would have, like everything else, So, like if they're in a vehicle, it can corrupt or it can invade the computers in the car and, I, I just made this up. I mean, I'm not saying it's a great idea.
Okay, well, yeah, no, I'm just trying to give feedback on what's right here. So it sounds
Oh,
like you have too many hooks in that version of the story, or too much going on. It sounds like a couple different movies
okay.
combined. Like AI detective tries to solve a crime would be one movie. Sympathetic vampire hero tries to maintain his cover and ethically pursue vampirism while avoiding an evil detective. That's like another movie. So I would try to
hmm
limit the amount of stuff you have going on. I would pull back on the AI angle here. And the detective sending a virus to starve the vampire, that sounds like a scene in a movie, but it doesn't sound like the whole movie.
Yeah.
Whereas the logline is supposed to sort of tell us what the whole movie is. So maybe it's something
Mm,
like, after, a vampire that has tried to live his life in an ethical way, he gets outed by a relentless, anti-undead detective Now the vampire has to stop his life from falling apart as the detective tries to take him down. Or maybe he has to defend his friends and family or something like that because the detective is going after them. That sounds like more like the basis of a movie rather than this, which would just sort of be like a scene or two.
Okay. I just, I was just trying to come up with something, and immediately I thought, oh, vampire 3D organs. Oh, wait, they need blood, bones. Okay, they'll 3D print bones. So anyway, that's it.
Okay, well, hope those comments were helpful. Thank you for sharing that.
Oh, sure.
Let's keep it going. Dakota. Oh, he left. Did he leave?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, he did. Okay, is there one more that I didn't get to?
There's Mario's.
Mario, do you want to go or do you want to wait?
I'll go, but I'll do a new one, right?
Oh, okay.
Can I say before that, Michelle, I can hear you breathing.
Yeah, make sure your
Oh,
mics are muted, guys. Please click the gray microphone icon to mute your mic when you're not speaking.
Okay, so the new one is after her dead mother is mysteriously resurrected, a bully teen must stop her own mother from killing everyone who has ever wronged her, no matter how minor the wrong.
I like it. Do you have a title or comps or anything?
The English teacher.
The English teacher. Okay. There's a TV
Her
show
mom is the English teacher.
on FX that just came out called The English Teacher.
Yeah, I know. I was watching it.
Oh, okay. This sounds like it would be called something like Mother Knows Best or something like that. Okay,
Oh,
after her
yeah,
dead
yeah.
mother is mysteriously resurrected, a bullied teen must stop her own mother. So we said the word mother twice. I would just wonder if there's a way to avoid listing the same subject 2 times in this. So after her dead mother's after a blank and blank woman is resurrected, her daughter must stop her from killing, maybe something like that. I would just try to avoid repeating the same phrase in a logline if you can. A bullied teen must stop her from killing everyone who has ever wronged her, no matter how minor the wrong. Okay, I get it. I can see this as a sort of campy, fun, maybe even sarcastic, funny sort of slasher. Especially because you say no matter how minor the wrong, that kind of tells me that no matter what little thing somebody's done to bother her, the mom's killing, even her friends are in danger, I would guess, because they're like bad.
Yeah, that's the
influences
hook.
or things like that. Got it. Okay. So I would. So resurrection must stop her. So we have a good sense of the protagonist, strong goal, a good antagonist with a strong motivation there, and the goal of the movie basically just being stop the killer does work. Killing everyone who has ever wronged her, no matter how minor the wrong. It's a bit of an unusual phrasing for a logline, but it actually does pretty much clarify the movie for me, so I think it works well. I think what I would do is... Let me ask this question. Her mom is a teacher, right? Is she like a member of the like a notoriously sort of strict teacher or something like that? Or like how is the mom seen in the community prior to her death?
So her mom is strict, and then so the people that she failed, right, kind of knows that the teen is her daughter, and so bullies the daughter, and his teen is afraid of the repercussions and didn't tell her mom. And there's this mysterious thing that affects her mom. It's like her mom has something. It's like a hereditary thing, and it snaps, and her mom kills those 5 people, and then after she kills those 5 people, the cops find out, and her mom suicides. But her mom's kind of genetic grudge or something, it kind of resurrects her, and then comes back to life.
Wait, I thought she came back to life and then she became a killer. Who does she
No,
kill?
no. She murders 5 people. He murders the bullies first. The really bad ones. The ones that like took pictures of her and like kind of burned his own daughter. He kills them first. And then when she gets surrounded by cops, she takes her own life, right? And then she resurrects and starts killing like more bullies.
More bullies?
Yeah.
That's not quite what the logline says. I thought I totally got the movie until you started explaining it. Now I'm kind of lost again. The structure that I was imagining here was the mom dies of... So what it sort of seems like you're saying is the mom dying is like the catalyst.
Yes.
It is. So you're saying she kills 5
Yep.
people before the catalyst?
She kills 5 people before the catalyst.
I don't quite understand how that makes sense, but we're not here to do deep dives into story at the moment.
Yeah.
The logline right here is mostly working, and I thought I understood the movie. Maybe you're saying it's actually something different, and that it may be the case that you need to change the logline to make it closer to reflecting what the movie actually is, which would be something like after her mom snaps and goes and gets revenge on her bullies, and it's so many inciting incidents this way. It just feels like a much more complicated version of what this logline is promising.
It's a novel type of logline.
Right. I'm
a novel guy, so like this fits the novel structure, which needs a kind of a little bit more triggers.
I see. Okay. So in that case, my note for you is to change the logline to reflect what the movie is more. Or to
More
change
words.
your concept of the movie to reflect this logline, which would probably not involve the mom killing people before the catalyst even happens.
So she kills before and after. So I was thinking I don't even mention that in the logline because the only thing is to lure the people to read it. It's not exactly what the story is, but it's somewhat like the story. Does that make sense? That's what I was going for.
It does, but it's just misleading. I mean, was the mom always a killer?
Yeah, always a killer.
Her entire life, she's always been sort of psychopathic.
Yep, she's always been a killer. It's just that when her daughter got bullied, she stopped being careful.
Okay, that's like a third movie that I didn't even. That sounds like 3 movies in one. At this point,
Yeah.
I totally thought I got it
Yeah.
from a simple logline. Now I'm realizing I didn't have any sense of what this was. So there's some issues there. This feels too complicated and like muddled. But the
Not for a
logline's good.
novel.
Logline's working.
Yeah,
Maybe for a
logline's
novel
working.
it could be easier. Yep, that's true. So I don't even exactly know how to give you notes now that my understanding of the story has totally.
I mean, I
changed.
could do a simple one. I know the idea that you're talking about. It's a simple one where he just starts killing. There's no he just dies and then resurrects and then starts killing the bullies that wronged her.
My
In
thought
fact,
was
it could
that-
be the bullies that killed the mom.
Right, or that they maybe some it could also be that the bullies themselves kill the mom, or as a result of the bully's actions. Maybe they kill one of her other kids, and as a result she takes her life, or something like that. But usually we would understand her death and resurrection to be why she's now a killer, because going from we're watching, essentially we would be watching the birth of a slasher, in that we see the event that leads to the creation, whatever gives her the powers to return after death, and also the motivation to come back and kill. It's like those would be one and the same. Go ahead.
There's a 5th movie where there's a slasher virus that infects certain people and certain generations. So her mom is one of the descendants of this. There's just a whole universe.
Oh, okay.
in my head.
This just sounds
I
like
just
a
thought
book,
up right now.
like an urban fantasy book series almost at this point, less
Yeah,
like
yeah.
a slasher movie. But if you want to pursue this as a feature, I would try to pare down and simplify as much as possible. Like,
Yeah,
we don't want to
I
have
agree.
multiple
I
inciting
agree.
incidents. We want to have one incident that everything is tied to, and then what we're watching is a series of ramifications of that. So that would probably be mom is not a killer until the bullies strike, and and maybe even the mom is like an upstanding member of the community, maybe a beloved teacher, until they push her too far. Maybe they kill her, or maybe she runs into a burning building to save her kid and ends up dying as a result. And now that vengeance is what brings her back from the grave to get revenge on those bullies and everybody else that ever messes with her kid. It's like the mother's love that is her motive, and also her reason for, it's the fuel for the supernatural too. So that version just kind of condenses things and makes them a little more streamlined, which would probably work better for a movie. But if you're doing a book series or something like that, the rules kind of go out the window.
Yeah, no, I agree. I also thought this your version as well. Not as detailed, but I do like the adaptation. You can write the adaptation after I'm finished with the book.
Okay, very generous.
I'm
Thank you.
kidding. All right.
All right. Thank you for that. Let's start to wrap up because we are a few minutes over our time. So I hope you guys got some good tips today. Again, come back next week. We hope to see you all back next week because you can pitch the version of your movie that you've developed based on the feedback that you got today. If you have indeed shared one. Sorry, my text is too big there. Whoop, let's shrink that down. We have plenty of other events going on Script Camp. This is just Feature Bootcamp that runs Fridays from 6 to 8 p.m. Let me show up on screen. There we are. From 6 to 8 p.m. Pacific time every Friday night. I'm also teaching TV writing on Sundays from 11 to 1. And while tomorrow we don't have a novel bootcamp class, we will be coming back. Novel classes will be coming back next week, Saturdays from 12 to 2. We also have table reads, swaps, and plenty of other great stuff coming up and happening all the time here on Script Camp. I will leave you here with this overview of the upcoming bootcamp schedule, and we really hope to see you next Friday at 6 so you can share your updated ideas, or if you didn't get a chance to share today or you had some great idea or innovation based on an earlier idea today, you can bring that next week for more feedback in the free open class September 27th. All right, thanks so much for coming, guys. Hope